The house began to breathe. Rain came down in diagonal blades, carving silver scars into the streetlights, and turning gutters into thin black mouths that swallowed leaves whole. The title belongs to this moment because it promises a haunting that is not a ghost, but a hunger. Walls that expand and contract like lungs, rooms that hold a pulse, and a choice that bruises the soul until it splits. The sound was faint at first, a damp, patient exhale that rose through the vents and trembled under the baseboards, like a sleeper testing whether it was safe to open its eyes. Mara stood in the foyer with a towel coiled around her hair, water dripping from the hem of an old sweatshirt that clung to her wrists, and stared at the staircase that had carried generations up and down like a tide. This was her grandmother's house, the house that took everything and then pretended it had not asked. The house her mother had run from the way deer run from a sudden opening in the woods. Now it was Mara's burden and sanctuary, promised to her in a will that arrived 3 weeks after the funeral and 2 days after her mother stopped answering the phone, with a note that simply read, "Keep it breathing." What Mara wanted, what she clutched like a hot coin inside her chest, was simple enough to name and impossible to hold without burning her palms. To bring her mother back to herself, to unspool the knot of silence that had tightened around her since the accident last winter, to be seen without being weighed, to be chosen over the past. The obstacle rose from the floorboards and the old photographs and the attic trunk that no one touched. A lineage threaded with bargains and disappearances, with mirrors turned to the wall and a door at the end of the 3rd floor hallway that had been painted shut and then wallpapered over, as if closing something were the same as undoing it. Every scene in this house would test Mara's will against the house's appetite. The central clash of intention and obstacle set and waiting. A rope pulled taut between what she loved and what the house demanded. She lit the hallway lamps one by one, each bulb breathing alive with a low hum that braided with the rain. The carpet was old, but not soft. It had the unforgiving texture of a tongue that does not forgive. In the dining room, a long table held the shapes of absences. 4 places, 3 chairs, 1 empty space where a high chair had once been kept, and a watermark in the grain, like a ring left by a glass that sweated all summer. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Evan again, the last friend who still called after the memorial, the one who refused to let grief be an excuse to dissolve. She ignored it, letting the call throb against her thigh until it gave up, leaving a phantom vibration that made her feel superstitious and slightly ashamed. Her mother had moved into the guest room on the 1st floor the day they arrived, claiming the stairs made her dizzy. But the truth was simpler and sharper. The master bedroom faced the lake, and the lake had been the last place her father's breath had fogged the air. The house inhaled, a slow draw through vents and keyholes, and Mara felt a pressure in her ears, the way one does before a storm breaks. She followed the sound up the main staircase, her fingers gliding along the banister. Varnish worn to the delicate velvet of old wood on the landing turned right. A thin corridor with framed photographs of women and their daughters ran like a spine. None of them looked directly at the camera. Each head turned just enough to make a viewer wonder what they had been listening to when the shutter snapped. At the end of that corridor lay the door that was not a door, the one papered over with a pattern of winter roses and thorns. The place her grandmother had called the stitch. If a house is a body, the stitch is where skin closes over a wound, a seam that pretends to be unbroken while every nerve below it remembers. The wallpaper here was smooth and cold, and grew colder when Mara touched its center. Condensation beaded beneath her palm, as if the other side were breathing harder than she was. "Don't," came her mother's voice from the foot of the stairs, tired and frayed, every word carrying the weight of submerged years. Mara turned. Her mother was small in the dim light, her hair a gray waterfall around her cheeks, the robe knotted like a tourniquet around her waist. "Some doors stay shut," her mother said, and the words were a memory of an argument that had not yet happened. "What if this one doesn't?" Mara asked, and it was not defiance so much as a child's last unbroken hope. Her mother rubbed the space above her heart, as if something there had begun to ache again. In the silence that followed, the house exhaled a long, low sigh that made the wallpaper lift and lay down in a movement so slight that Mara might have called it imagination if the pattern hadn't rippled like a pond's surface. That night, she dreamed of a hallway that turned back on itself like a ribbon, and of a mirror with a keyhole in its center, and of a voice that said, very gently, "At last." She woke before dawn with the taste of iron in her mouth, and the certainty that the house was not haunted by anything that had once been living. It was haunted by a choice. Mara made coffee in the dark, the machine hissing like an animal that had learned to live with leashes. She took the mug up to the corridor and sat on the floor opposite the stitch, steam unfurling into the cool like a story, trying to decide where to begin. What she felt then was not bravery, but refusal, the shape of her intention sharpened by grief and fear. She would open whatever the house meant to keep, and she would not let it take her mother again. When the first pale light of morning stretched the wallpaper roses into ghostly mouths, the paper puckered, then softened, as if breath moved behind it. A small bulge rose where a doorknob would be, smoothing out, and then pressing forward again, until the paste cracked with a sound like a fingernail dragged over a balloon. Mara reached for the pocket knife she carried when storms knocked out the power, thumbed it open, and set the blade against the seam that had pretended not to exist. The house inhaled once more, deeper now, its ribs wide, its appetite awake. As she drew the first careful line, paper parted, and a cool draft curled over her fingers, carrying a smell like rain striking hot stone, like iron, like the air inside a church the moment before a secret is whispered. She paused, and in the pause, she understood the open loop she was stepping into. Whatever waited here would not be solved in a day, and the thing it offered would not be given without a price. The knife resumed its work, and with it came the whisper that seemed to rise from the new dark. Choose. The cut widened, the wallpaper's winter roses drifting to the floor in damp petals, until the shape of a door declared itself, not proud, but patient, like a bruise. Mara pressed the heel of her hand against the spot where a knob should have been. The surface gave as if its bones remembered being wood, and had not yet decided whether to forgive her when it swung inward. It did so without hinges, the motion continuous, like a held breath finally released. Inside, the corridor was narrow and unlit, but not dark. The air glowed the way skin does when a hand is held against a bare light bulb. No source, only suffusion. The walls were the color of old ice. The floor gave beneath her steps with the faintest elastication, an almost living yield that made her think of kneeling on a church kneeler as a child, her grandmother's gloved hand on the back of her head. She moved forward because to step back felt like inviting the house to exhale and close her out forever. Her phone flashlight skated over the walls. Embedded there were shapes like shadows caught mid-breath, the outline of a comb, a key, a folded letter, a child's wooden block with the letter M, as if the house had swallowed tokens and pressed them to its ribs to remember who had fed it. When she touched the letter, her finger tingled, and a little voice that was not hers whispered, "Mine." She pulled back, flexing her hand, feeling foolish and tender at once. At the corridor's end stood the mirror. She had dreamt the frame narrow and black, the glass dim with a kind of living dusk, and a small keyhole at its center, like a pupil that refused to dilate. The air in front of it was cooler, the scent of rain-on iron sharpened, and with it a low sound like the hush of a congregation right before the bride appears. That hopeful, frightened silence. She stepped close enough to see her face fog the surface, and then clear. Her reflection held, but behind her own features, something else moved, a slowness like a creature that slept under warm sand and had learned patience from geology. "What do you want?" she asked, voice steady, with the kind of steadiness that cannot last, the steadiness that belongs to those who haven't yet been asked the price. The mirror did not answer, rather. The house answered in the language of the body. The distant radiator sighed. The staircase wood ticked as it settled. A door below whispered against its frame, as though it had been touched by a draft. Then, faint and unmistakable, another sound threaded the air, her mother's laugh, but not the thin, tired thing it had been lately. The old laugh from summers before the lake took what it took, bright and bell-like and teasing, a sound that lifted something in Mara, and then held it suspended until it trembled. "Mara," the voice was clear, very close, as if the mirror were a window cracked open to a porch, where someone waited with a sweater over her shoulders. "Baby." The The second word cleaved the space between grief and recognition. Mara's mouth filled with the metallic taste again. But this time, there was sweetness at the edge of it, like the first strawberry of June. She swallowed hard, fingertips grazing the cool glass. The keyhole pulsed once, a small throb that drew her eye. It was no larger than the head of a nail, but the sense it gave off was enormous, like a tiny blood vessel that knows it feeds the heart. "I don't have a key," Mara whispered, and the mirror made of its silence a question. "Don't you?" She touched the chain at her neck where she wore her grandmother's locket. Inside was nothing but a lock of hair and a pressed violet. When she held the locket near the keyhole, the air tightened as if the house were trying not to breathe, and then a low click traveled into her bones. She should have turned away. She should have called her mother. She should have said Evan's name out loud like a lifeline. Instead, she leaned in and pressed the locket into the keyhole, the way one presses a beloved story into the space between day and sleep, expecting it to be held. The mirror drank it, the chain slithering between her fingers like a small animal returning to its burrow. The glass did not shatter, it softened. Ripples spread from the center outward, as if a flat lake had been touched by a fingertip. And in those ripples, rooms assembled and unassembled. Her mother's childhood kitchen, the lake at noon, with dragonflies skimming its skin, the hospital hallway that smelled like lemon and fear, her father's handwriting on an envelope addressed to the future. Each image was both itself and a baited hook. The voice returned, and this time it was not her mother's, and not her mother's. At last, it murmured, kind as a nurse tucking in a sheet too tight, kind the way a net is kind to a fish, gentleness that only feels like mercy because it delays. Choose. What am I choosing? Mara asked, though some ancient, marrow-deep knowledge had already written the menu on the back of her eyes. The mirror darkened, then clarified. Two images settled and held, side by side, like the answers on a test where both are wrong. On the left, her mother stood in the doorway of the guest room, eyes bright, the gray lifted from her hair, the robe replaced by the old sweater that smelled like clove cigarettes and peppermint gum. Behind her, the house's lights burned warm and even, and a lake in the distance lay asleep, its surface untroubled. On the right, Evan stood on the porch with a duffel over his shoulder and a hesitation in his mouth that meant he would stay if asked. He was 10 years of summers and winters, late-night drives, and shared silence. The person who had sat with her outside the ICU and not spoken, because sometimes words are wolves, and they will eat what they are sent to save. Behind him, the house flickered, lights stuttering like a tired heartbeat. The lake stood up in wind. 2 doors, the voice said, and the language rearranged her bones. One opens to the one who made you, and the one who lost herself when you were no longer a mirror for her joy. The other to the one who sees you without asking to be fed. The mirror did not explain the price. Mirrors rarely do, but Mara knew. as one knows the temperature of a fever by the way a mother's palm hovers before it touches. Choose one, and the house will breathe easier, but require tribute. Choose the other, and the house will gorge now and sleep later. She reached out, her fingers hovered over the left image, then the right, her skin prickling with the awareness of decision. The way a field prickles just before lightning shows it its bones. She thought of her grandmother's note. Keep it breathing. Had it been a blessing or an instruction? A bequest or a curse? Both, the way any inheritance is. Downstairs, a glass fell and did not break. The sound rose and settled like a bird that decides the sill is safe. In the mirror, her mother's mouth shaped a name that might have been Mara, and might have been the name she had for her own fear. Evan's hand, empty of his duffel now, lifted as if to knock, though he was already on the porch. Mara set her palm flat to the glass. The cool spread into her skin like water into a dry cloth. I choose, she began, and the house drew its breath so sharply the hallway seemed to lean. She did not finish the sentence. The mirror took the choice out of her mouth and held it the way a storm holds a last leaf on a branch, not shaking it loose yet, not letting it rest either. Come back at midnight, the voice said, almost playful now, as if the game had been set and only patience remained to be tested. A house should never make a decision in the daytime. The glass smoothed, the images faded, and the keyhole went blind. The corridor, which had not moved, felt longer, and Mara, who had not yet lost anything new, felt bereft. She turned away and almost collided with her mother. The older woman stood in the narrow space, eyes wide and wet, breath shallow, hand clutching her chest. What did you do? Her mother whispered. The same words, different now, more plea than condemnation. Mara opened her mouth to explain, and found that explanations were stones, heavy, ugly, and only useful if one needed to build a wall. I found a door, she said instead, truth and not truth. Like most things that keep families together, just long enough to tear them apart. Midnight waited, a hinge inside the day. In the house, cupboards sighed and the radiator ticked. The lake rehearsed its small waves against the old dock, practicing for larger grief. Upstairs, the stitch held, but the seam had learned the shape of her hand. Time has teeth when it is asked to wait. It gnaws at the edges of resolve. It tests for soft places. It counts and recounts what it has taken to see if anything new might be spared. The hours to midnight were not hours so much as a tightening in the air that made the house's breaths sound like an animal being gentle, because it had learned gentleness increased the chance of being fed. Mara did not leave, even when Evan texted, "I'm on the porch if you want company." She stared at the words and felt her throat close around them like a fist. She made soup that neither of them ate. Her mother sat at the table with her hands around a mug she did not drink from, eyes fixed on the lake through the rain-streaked window. There are silences that soothe and silences that accuse. This one did both. Depending on which of them breathed first. "Your grandmother used to tell stories about the house," her mother said finally, voice low, as if speaking too loudly might wake something. She said it was built on a place where a choice had been made so sharply that the ground remembered. She turned the mug, steam thin and already losing its shape. She said the women in our family learned to bargain because the house taught them to. And that's why none of us are any good at leaving. "I don't want to bargain," Mara said. Each word a small rock she laid in front of herself to see if a path might appear. "I want you back." Her mother flinched, and the guilt rose like heat. A weather system inside Mara she could not control. "I'm right here," her mother said softly. "The way people say I'm fine, when what they mean is please don't ask, because I won't stop." "I know," Mara replied, and they both pretended the truth inside the lie did not have claws. The storm burned itself out. The night became damp and watchful. Mara checked the front door. Through the ripple of old glass, she saw Evan, hood up, hands in pockets, the posture of someone trying not to scare a stray animal. She did not open the door. She laid her palm against the wood and felt the grain, accept her touch the way the mirror had. At 11:42, the house began to hum in a key that made her molars ache. At 11:58, the hum subsided, and a new sound arrived. A heartbeat that did not belong to any one person. A pulse woven from stairs and pipes, and wind and memory. At midnight, the stitch exhaled, and the wallpaper lifted like a curtain at a matinee where only the desperate attend. Mara climbed the stairs with a glass of water in her hand, because it felt like something one carries into a hospital room. And if this was birth or death, water is what the living bring. The corridor drank in her presence, walls cool against her shoulders when she brushed them, whispering small friction sighs like sheets being smoothed. At the mirror, the keyhole shone with a steady, soft light that did not illuminate anything but itself. "Back," the voice said, not unkind. "Door to door." The glass clouded, then cleared, and the two images returned. But they were sharper now, crueler, because they included not only promise, but aftermath. On the left, her mother woke the next morning humming, made pancakes that tasted like sundaes, sat on the porch, and told Mara the truth about the day she had left the hospital against medical advice. The truth about the drowned silence she had been cultivating like a garden. Behind them, the house grew quiet, full, sated. On the right, Evan moved into the spare room for a month, and then never really moved out. He put new locks on the windows and fixed the porch steps and learned the names of the lake's winds. He made Mara laugh in the kitchen while washing peaches, their skins like sun-warmed suede. Behind them, the house flickered, but did not swallow, restless, but not ruthless. In both threads, the lake gleamed like a patient animal, dangerous only if disrespected, which is to say always. "What is the price?" Mara asked, her voice thinner now, the water in the glass trembling with the small vibrations of the house's attention. "One," the voice said, delighted by her finally asking the correct question. One of what you love, to keep the house breathing. One of what you fear, to keep it sleeping. Both eventually, because that is how breathing works. The cruel truth of bargains is not in the terms, it is in the calendar. Pay now or pay later, but all accounts are reconciled. Mara stood with this, holding the water the way one holds a line in a storm, and felt her intention test its knot against her obstacle's mast. I won't feed you, my mother, she said, and the voice purred, content as a cat that has been told it is beautiful. Then feed me your future, it said, and the mirror brightened on the right side, Evan's smile widening into a home she could have lived in. No, she said again, and the mirror dimmed, offended without surprise. Then choose yourself, the voice murmured, almost bored. You are a meal that lasts. The sentence snapped against her skin like cold. She thought, briefly, and without shame, of disappearing into the mirror if it meant her mother would sing again, and Evan would stop hovering at thresholds, and the house would learn a quieter song. To be consumed to keep others from being consumed felt like a neat arithmetic and a failure of imagination. She lifted the glass of water and poured it slowly onto the floor in front of the mirror. The boards drank greedily. The puddle's surface trembled under a breath she could not feel on her face. I brought you what the living bring, she said, her voice steadier now. You can breathe without eating us, the mirror laughed, a soft, indulgent sound like the moment before a parent tells a child the game has been called on account of darkness. Water is for beginnings, it said. We are past that. Behind Mara, footsteps in the corridor. Evan, who had finally let himself in, who would always let himself in if the lights were on and the silence too heavy, stepped into the thin glow, his face pale and set. I couldn't just wait, he said, apology and defiance braided in his tone. Her mother appeared a breath later, robe pulled tight, eyes on the mirror as if it were an old friend who had betrayed her in a way that made remaining friends impossible and leaving dangerous. All of you, the voice said, pleased. Now that is a table. The corridor pulsed, floor flexing, walls swelling, the mirror's surface rising like a held breath that would not be released until someone paid. Mara stepped between the mirror and the people she loved. She is small, but small things block sharp things better than they are given credit for. Listen, she said to them, not taking her eyes off the glass. It wants a choice, but the trick is the frame. The frame makes the choice look like two when there are more. Her grandmother had taught her this without meaning to, in the way she set the table. Fork here, knife here, spoon here. But also hands, also breath, also hunger that could be fed with a story when the soup ran thin. What else is there? Evan asked, his hands open, empty, ready to carry something heavy if someone would name it. Mara took a slow breath and felt the house take it with her, reluctant and curious. We give it what it cannot digest, she said. We give it what cannot be consumed, because it is not singular. What is that? Her mother whispered. and fear cleaned her question into a prayer. "A promise," Mara said, "but not the kind that binds a person like rope. The kind that binds a place like weather." She turned to the mirror, which watched with the indulgence of predators who have learned that speech fattens the meat. "I promise you breath," she said clearly. "I promise you breath as long as we live here. And I promise you breath afterward too, because breath is not owned, it is shared. I promise stories and names, and the kind of laughter that makes walls remember the shape of joy. I promise your ribcage will never be empty, but you will not eat us." Silence, shocked and bright. The house held still in a way that hurt. The mirror rippled, offended. Promises are indigestible because they require participation. "If you will not feed me, why should I breathe?" the voice asked, genuinely curious, and for the first time, a little afraid. "Because we will teach you how," Mara said. "Because breath is a habit as much as a hunger, and habits can be learned." It was a gamble so large she felt lightheaded, a rope thrown across a chasm, without checking if the other side held a tree. "Teach me," the voice said, a hum thickening. The mirror cleared. The left and right futures dissolved like ink in water. In their place, an image bloomed. The house with all its windows open, summer air ribboning through rooms, voices overlapping from kitchen to porch, footsteps that did not run to or away, but toward, and then, like a hand closing softly around a wrist, the price revealed itself, because prices do not disappear, they arrive late, dressed as mercy. "One breath for one secret," the voice said, "a secret that hurts you to tell, and once told, cannot be taken back. For every breath you teach me, you give me one of those." Mara's stomach turned. She thought of the secret she had been growing in the dark part of her ribs since the lake iced over, that the day of the accident she had wished for quiet so ferociously the wish had felt like a thrown stone. She had not made the ice crack, but she had named the silence that followed, and names are a kind of lever. Her mother's hand found her elbow, bone to bone. Evan's shoulder brushed hers, a steadying line. "Don't," her mother whispered, and it was the most mother-sounding word she had said in a year. Mara swallowed. "First breath," she said, and the house leaned in with its entire body. "I wished him gone." The house took the secret like a lung takes air, greedy, astonished, relieved. The boards under Mara's feet softened. The corridor widened by a hair. The radiator sighed in a lower key. Somewhere, a door unlatched in a room she had never been in. The mirror pulsed, pleased and patient. Because once someone has started telling that kind of truth, the body remembers how to continue. Her mother made a sound like something fragile being set down with care on a hard surface. Evan did not move, but his presence shifted, more weight on the foot closest to Mara, as if he could absorb what would spill next. Mara pressed her palm flat against the glass, so the cool would wake the parts of her that wanted to sleep until consequences passed by. "Second breath," the voice said, and it did not sound cruel. It sounded like a midwife. "The secret you hold about your mother." Secrets organize themselves. They line up, heads bowed, each convinced it will be chosen because it was fed the most. This one stepped forward. I resent you for grieving him more loudly than you loved me. Mara closed her eyes. When you stopped looking at me, I learned how to walk without weight, so the floor wouldn't notice I was still in the house. The boards hummed in recognition. I started to prefer rooms without mirrors, because reflection makes liars of the kind of truths I live with. The glass cooled further. A mercy. I wanted you to choose me, and I hated you for not knowing. That was the only choice left. Her mother's fingers left her elbow. A chair in some other room cried out, as if someone had sat down too hard. The house's breath hitched, then deepened. Secrets are calories for a place like this, but unlike bodies, houses bulk on what hurts and become lighter on what is shared. Third, the voice murmured. About the one on the porch, Evan let out a small, involuntary laugh. The kind people make sitting in waiting rooms when the television tells a joke meant for living rooms. Mara looked at him. He met her eyes without flinching. A gift she had not asked for, because asking is a kind of debt. I have rehearsed losing you so many times I forgot to practice keeping you, she said, when you text and I don't answer. It isn't because I don't want to. It's so I can control at least one thing you offer me. His face changed in the way faces do when they are reorganized by understanding. Not better, not worse, only truer. The mirror's surface brightened, fed but not sated. More, it whispered. Greed, even gentle greed, is never satisfied by round numbers. It wants the one it doesn't have. Mara leaned her forehead to the glass. No, she said softly. The corridor cooled. The bargain is breath for secret, and breath must be paced. She thought of the Lamaze class her mother had told her about once, a story from a life where there had been plans for siblings, how one learns to count and breathe, so pain does not own the body entirely. The house protested, an adolescent huff that rattled the vents. The mirror smoothed, temper held. Teach me, it said again, and in the saying was the first hint of surrender. Open the windows, Mara said, all of them. The command moved through the house like a flock catches clicked. Sashes lifted, screens shivered, cold night air spilled in with the clean bite of leaves and far-off wood smoke. The curtains swelled, each one a lung. The house's breath became audible even to those who had not been listening. Now, she said, voice low, in through the east rooms, out through the west. It obeyed in the only way a place can obey, by aligning itself with the weather. The corridor's pressure shifted. The hallway draft turned into a current. The mirror caught the flow and held it, not as prey, but as pattern. Her mother began to cry, not the sharp, shattering kind, but the long kind that cleans corners. Evan leaned against the opposite wall and let himself slide down to sit, knees up, palms open on his thighs. The posture of someone who has set down a bag they carried too long. The house breathed. Again, Mara said, and they did it, windows wide, doors cracked, vents humming. The house's hum shifted from hunger to habit. The mirror dimmed to a gentle dusk. The keyhole went from eye to scar. The stitch no longer looked like a wound. It looked like a mouth learning to speak. Outside, the lake lay black and glassy. Somewhere across it, a fox screamed, a sound that always makes the human body prepare to run and never remember why it does not. The house listened and did not imitate. "What now?" Evan asked quietly. Mara felt the exhaustion that comes after surviving the first night of a fever, relief braided with vigilance. "Now we live," she said, "one breath for one truth, when we can afford it." She looked at her mother, whose eyes were red and clear. "And we tell the ones we can to each other before we give them to the walls." Her mother nodded, a motion that acknowledged both debt and grace. "Tomorrow," she said, and it was not a delay, it was a promise. Downstairs, the front door opened without complaint. Evan stood and offered his hand, and she took it, not because she needed help standing, but because standing together is different from standing. They went down into the house that had been taught, just a little, to breathe without devouring. In the kitchen, bowls waited and soup had cooled. The clock over the stove ticked like an old heart that intends to keep working if oil is provided. And the whole contraption is not asked to climb stairs. They ate, and the taste was not good, but it was honest. And sometimes that is how survival begins, with the mouth disappointed and the body grateful. Open loops remained. The mirror would hunger again. The price would ask for installments. The lake would not forget the name they had given its silence. But urgency had shifted farther down the hall, from now to soon. And in that distance, hope found enough floor to set down a chair. To be continued. To be continued.